It's been 49 years since Fantasy Island opened its gates on ABC, and the promise was simple. Anything you want, you can have it here. 7 seasons, 152 episodes, a white suit, a bell tower, and a mysterious host who granted wishes to strangers. By every measure, it should have been disposable television. Instead, it became a hallucination 3 generations never fully woke from. What the people who built it received in return is more complicated than anything the writers put on screen. Let's see where they are in 2026. Ricardo Montalban as Mr. Roarke. Ricardo Gonzalo Pedro Montalban y Marino was born on November 25, 1920 in Mexico City, Mexico. He was 57 years old when Fantasy Island began its weekly run in January 1978. Already one of the most recognizable faces in American film and television. A man who had spent 3 decades navigating the specific challenges of being a major Latin actor in an industry that rarely knew what to do with major Latin actors. He was the show's prestige anchor, and he understood the assignment from the first frame. Mr. Roarke was not a host. He was a force. Elegant, morally ambiguous, calm in a way that suggested access to information other people didn't have. He turned what could have been a gimmick premise into a ritual viewers returned to every Saturday night. The white suit was not a costume, it was a declaration. But here's what made his time on that island something more than performance. He spent decades pushing back against Hollywood's tendency to cast Latin actors as villains and exotic furniture. He co-founded Nosotros, an organization dedicated to improving the image and opportunities of Hispanic performers, work he continued throughout the Fantasy Island years. The man in white who granted other people's fantasies was, off-screen, insisting that Latino actors deserved to be at the center of the story. He was married to Georgiana Young for over 60 years until her death in 2007. They had 4 children. He died on January 14, 2009 at 88. The man who sold fantasies for a price spent a real career fighting to be seen as more than a stereotype. Hervé Villechaize as TattooThe. Hervé Jean-Pierre Villechaize was born on April 23, 1943 in Montauban, France. He was 34 when Fantasy Island launched, already internationally recognizable as Knick-Knack in The Man with the Golden Gun, a role that had made his face known to cinema audiences 2 years before Tattoo made his voice a household sound. Tattoo was not just comic relief. He was the show's human spark, the character audiences waited for at the top of every episode, running toward the tower, waving his hat, delivering the line that launched 1,000 impressions. Deplane! Deplane! In a show built on elegant restraint, Villechaize was the release valve. The contrast between his energy and Montalban's stillness was the show's engine. But here's where things get genuinely painful. Tattoo's popularity did not protect Villechaize from what was happening behind the scenes. He eventually demanded pay parity with Montalban, a reasonable request from a performer whose face was equally central to the show's identity. The demand was refused. He was fired before the final season and replaced by Christopher Hewitt, leaving without the money or the acknowledgement his contribution had earned. Off-screen, Villechaize lived with chronic physical pain connected to his dwarfism that no level of celebrity could address. He had been married twice and had no children publicly documented. In his final years, the suffering became unmanageable. He died on September 4, 1993 at 50 by suicide, having left a note about his health. The man with television's most famous entrance spent his final years trapped in a body that made every exit harder. Joan Collins as Lucy Atwell. Joan Henrietta Collins was born on May 23, 1933 in Paddington, London, England. She was 44 when Fantasy Island began its weekly run in 1978. A RADA-trained actress working in British and American film and television since the early 1950s, carrying what the British press had labeled Britain's bad girl for long enough that she had stopped defending against it and started weaponizing it. Her appearance was prestige stunt casting. She brought instant sophistication, controlled danger, and glamour that arrives already knowing it owns the room. The show didn't need to introduce her, it needed to borrow her. But here's where the story opens out considerably. What Fantasy Island was for Collins was a waiting room. Dynasty came in 1981, and with it, Alexis Carrington, the defining performance of a career that had been building toward exactly this role for 30 years. The conniving ex-wife who wore shoulder pads like armor and treated every scene as a board meeting she intended to win. a Golden Globe in 1983, Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2015. She has been married 5 times and has 3 children. She married Percy Gibson in 2002, 32 years her junior, and has remained married to him in 2026. She is 92 years old. On Fantasy Island, she was a glamorous visitor. In television history, she became the storm that walked in and took over the room. Victoria Principal as Michelle. Vicky Ree Principal was born on January 3, 1950 in Fukuoka, Japan, the daughter of an American Air Force officer. She was 28 when Fantasy Island began, a rising actress in the precise weeks before Dallas turned her into one of the most recognizable faces on American television. Pamela Barnes Ewing, the sympathetic center of one of television's most operatically complicated families, made Principal a genuine star. Her Fantasy Island appearance now works as a retrospective hook. You are watching someone in the moments before the defining chapter of their career begins. But here's where the story goes somewhere most people don't follow it. After Dallas, Principal did not coast. She wrote books. She built a skincare brand, Principal Secret, that became a direct response television phenomenon, generating revenues in the hundreds of millions of dollars and establishing her as one of the most successful actress-turned-entrepreneurs in American entertainment history. She had 2 marriages and no children. Her most publicly documented relationship was with Andy Gibb in the early 1980s, a partnership whose end was connected to the addiction struggles that preceded his death in 1988. She is alive at 76. She arrived on Fantasy Island as a guest on someone else's dream and left television to build a business empire of her own. Gina Davis as Patricia Grayson. Virginia Elizabeth Davis was born on January 21, 1956 in Wareham, Massachusetts. She was 22 years old when Fantasy Island launched in 1978. Not yet an actress anyone outside casting rooms had heard of, appearing in a guest role on a show that was, at that point, one of the most watched programs on Saturday night television. For your purposes, the Fantasy Island appearance is almost entirely about what came next. The Fly, Beetlejuice, Thelma and Louise, the film that repositioned what a female action narrative could look like. The Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for The Accidental Tourist in 1989. But here's where the story builds into something few people anticipated. After the first act ended, Davis built a second one most actors never attempt. The Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media, founded in 2004, became one of the most significant advocacy organizations working on representation in film and television, using data to measure what Hollywood consistently failed to see about women on screen. She didn't just win an Oscar, she used the platform to change the conditions under which others could win them. She has 4 marriages and 3 children. She is alive at 70. On Fantasy Island, she was just passing through. In Hollywood, she stayed long enough to change the conversation itself. LeVar Burton as Edward Ross Jr. LeVardis Robert Martin Burton Jr. was born on February 16, 1957 in Landstuhl, West Germany. He was 20 years old when Fantasy Island launched in 1978, and the timing is everything. 1 year earlier, he had played Kunta Kinte in Roots, the most watched miniseries in American television history, a performance that introduced Burton to 100 million viewers and placed a weight on his shoulders that would have crushed most 20-year-olds. It did not crush him. He carried it and kept going, which turns out to be the central fact of his entire career. What followed Fantasy Island was a life built entirely on showing up for other people. Reading Rainbow, 23 years of encouraging children to read, hosted with warmth that was clearly not performance, ran from 1983 to 2006 and won 26 Emmy Awards. Then Star Trek The Next Generation, where he played Geordi LaForge for 7 seasons and became one of the defining faces of a franchise that never ends. Then decades of advocacy for literacy and education, sustained and quiet. He is married to Stephanie Cozart Burton and has 1 daughter. He is alive at 69. He arrived on Fantasy Island as a young actor, just absorbing the weight of Roots. He left American culture as one of its most trusted guides, the quality the island promises but rarely delivers. Michelle Phillips as the princess. Holly Michelle Gilliam was born on June 4th, 1944 in Long Beach, California, a name that became Michelle Phillips when the group became the Mamas and the Papas, one of the defining vocal groups of the 1960s and one of its most dramatically unstable arrangements. She was 33 when Fantasy Island's weekly run began, already carrying a decade of pop mythology and a reputation for surviving everything that came with it. Her early life was shaped by loss. Her mother died when she was young, a fact that runs quietly under a public persona built almost entirely on glamour, music, and resilience. But here's where the story asks more of her than the harmony. The Mamas and the Papas story is complicated in ways greatest hits compilations don't advertise. The internal dynamics, the relationships, the betrayals, the addiction, the collapse were as chaotic as the harmonies were perfect. Phillips survived it and did something most people who come through that kind of first act never manage. She built a completely different second one. Acting, television, film. A career that made the transition from pop star to working actress, which is harder than the industry makes it look. She has 3 children, including China Phillips, who would carry her own chapter of the musical family story forward. She is alive at 81. She came to Fantasy Island as a famous visitor. Her real trick was surviving one era of fame and building another one entirely. Lynn Redgrave as Jean Harrigan. Lynn Rachel Redgrave was born on March 8, 1943 in Marylebone, London, the youngest child of Sir Michael Redgrave and Rachel Kimpson, part of the most accomplished acting dynasty in British theatrical history. She was 34 when Fantasy Island began, already Oscar nominated for Georgie Girl, carrying a surname that arrives with its own inherited expectations. The show wasn't discovering her, it was borrowing her. Tragically, what marks Lynn Redgrave's later life is loss accumulated in layers. She was publicly candid about her struggle with bulimia, a struggle that shaped decades of her relationship with her body and her work, and that she eventually addressed directly in writing and performance. In 2003, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She managed it and continued working. Further grief arrived in the years that followed. She died on May 2, 2010 at 67 from breast cancer. She had 3 children. Her legacy rests on a transatlantic stage and screen career that stretched across more than 40 years, not on any single guest appearance. On Fantasy Island, she was a guest in someone else's story. In real life, she carried enough pain for several lifetimes and still kept performing. Sonny Bono as Scott Crane. Salvatore Philip Bono was born on February 16, 1935 in Detroit, Michigan. He was 42 when Fantasy Island's weekly run began in 1978. Already one of the most recognizable faces in American pop culture, a man whose career had been built around his willingness to be the less glamorous half of a very glamorous equation, and who had turned that willingness into a form of power most performers never locate. Sonny and Cher had been a phenomenon. The variety show had been a phenomenon. The divorce had been public theater. By 1978, Bono was in one of those holding patterns where the fame is real and the direction is unclear. But here's where the story becomes something no television writer could have invented. Sonny Bono ran for mayor of Palm Springs in 1988. He won. He then ran for Congress and won a seat in the House of Representatives in 1994, serving as a Republican congressman from California during one of the most volatile stretches in congressional history. He pushed legislation on copyright extension, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, that bears his name and still shapes intellectual property law in the United States today. He was, in other words, a man who moved from writing pop songs to writing law. He was married 4 times and had 4 children. He died on January 5, 1998 at 62 from massive head injuries sustained in a skiing accident in South Lake Tahoe. He showed up as a guest star on a fantasy series and ended up living one of the least predictable American lives of the 20th century. Linda Day George as Nora Leonard. Linda Louise Day was born on December 11, 1944 in San Marcos, Texas. She was 33 when Fantasy Island began, already a known television presence from Mission Impossible, where she had demonstrated the ability to carry dramatic weight in network television's most stylized action format. Her Fantasy Island appearance was 1970s television logic at its most reliable. Take a face the audience already trusts from another successful show and let that goodwill do the work in a new context. Linda Day George was exactly that kind of recognizable. But here's what lingers from her story off camera. She was married to actor Christopher George, a partnership that was both personal and professional for years, and that gave her career a structure and a context. Christopher George died on November 28, 1983 from a heart attack at 52. She was 38. The loss was sudden and left her to navigate the remainder of her career and life without the partner who had been central to both. She has 2 children. She is alive at 81. She came to the island as a guest. What lingers is the larger story of a woman whose real losses happened off camera and who kept working anyway. Lola Falana as Esther Bowling. Lolitha Elaine Falana was born on September 11, 1942 in Camden, New Jersey. She was 35 when Fantasy Island began, one of the most electric performers of her generation, a dancer, singer, and actress discovered by Sammy Davis Jr. in the 1960s, and built a career that burned at a voltage very few people in any era of entertainment can sustain. She had been called the First Lady of Las Vegas, a title earned through years of headlining the rooms that separate the institutions from everything else. She was also a major presence in Italian cinema in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a chapter almost entirely absent from American retrospectives. But here's where the story turns towards something the spotlight never reached. In the late 1980s, Falana was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. The diagnosis was severe enough that she temporarily lost the ability to walk, a specific cruelty for a performer whose entire identity had been built around movement. She underwent treatment, recovered partial function, and made a deliberate choice. She stepped away from show business and redirected her life toward faith and ministry, a commitment she has maintained publicly in the decades since, without apology or nostalgia for what she left behind. She had 1 marriage publicly documented. She is alive at 83. She brought show business sparkle to Fantasy Island, then spent the rest of her life turning away from the spotlight that once defined her, on her own terms and without looking back. Karen Valentine as Janet Fleming. Karen Lynn Valentine was born on May 25, 1947 in Sebastopol, California. She was 30 when Fantasy Island's weekly run began, already known to television audiences from Room 222, the ABC drama where she had played student teacher Alice Johnson and earned an Emmy Award in 1970. The story of how she got that first break is worth knowing. Producer Gene Reynolds saw her audition for Room 222 and realized, watching her fumble the material, that she was genuinely funny. He cast her on the spot. The flaw became the feature. The nervousness became Alice Johnson's defining quality, and Alice Johnson became one of the decade's most watched characters. But here's what makes Karen Valentine the quiet one in this sequence. She did not become a franchise, she did not build an empire or win an Oscar or move to Congress. She built a solid career across 1970s television, delivered reliably, and did so without the kind of public drama that makes for clean retrospective packaging. Her personal life remained comparatively private. She is alive at 78. She was never the loudest name on any guest list. In a sequence of lives defined by extremity, the tragedy, the reinvention, the second acts nobody planned, she may be the one who leaves the gentlest afterglow. Sometimes the most durable thing a performer can build is a reputation for being reliably, unpretentiously good. Karen Valentine was reliably good for longer than most. Fantasy Island ran for 7 seasons, 152 episodes, and 1 promise. Whatever you want, you can have it here. The price varied by the person. One man spent his real career building the organization that fought for what his industry kept refusing to give. One man had the most famous entrance in television and died at 50, trapped in a body that had been both his calling card and his sentence. One woman used a guest slot as a runway to dynasty and a damehood. One turned Dallas into a business empire. One won an Oscar and then built the machinery that might help someone else win one. One arrived as the young man still absorbing roots and became the most trusted guide of his generation. One survived a pop era that destroyed everything around it and built a second life from the pieces. One carried the grief of a dynasty alongside her own. One crossed from pop star to congressman to obituary in a story no one could have written. One kept working through the kind of loss that stops most people cold. One walked away from the spotlight on her own terms. And one showed up, did the work with grace, and asked for nothing louder than that. The island promised everyone a fantasy, What they received was the rest of their lives.